Thank you very much for coming. What a wonderful, intimate group. It was worth the drive from Orono. And John broke my heart by telling me the Icelandic bakery is closed. That was one of my primary reasons for coming to Toba Foxcroft in the past. But life will go on now that I know there's a good Thai restaurant in Heartland.
Yeah.
It's not really on your way.
I'm not on my way, but I'll detour for it. Well, thank you so much. You know, the long and the short of it is that I have adopted 2 boys, and one is from Russia, one is from Ukraine. I said, how interesting this age we're in light of what's going on over there. I said, I'm positioned perfectly to say, yes, Ukrainians and Russians can get along. So I tell people I have one of each, and they get along with each other. Okay. So the story is, it starts with the fall of the Soviet Union. Oh, first, I'll say something about myself. I'm sorry about that. My name is Bob Klose. I live in Orono. I teach at the University of Maine. And I also write. And I write nonfiction, and I write fiction. I write novels as well. I also write essays for the Christian Science Monitor in Boston, and for other periodicals as well. I write short stories. And I found that teaching is a bottomless pit of inspiration. And saying that, I have to turn off my phone. I tell my students, if their phones go off while I'm teaching, they must immediately call their parents and tell them that they love them. And so I make sure my phone is off too. And so that's my background. And my field of study is biology. But at this point in my career, I'm teaching in what they call the Honors College. So I have the privilege of teaching highly motivated students right out of high school who really want to do well, and they do everything I ask of them. Mm-hmm. I said to the dean just the other day, she said, how's it going? How is it going? I have 15 students, and we sit around a table, we discuss great books. I said, these students are so pure, I want to take them home and tuck them in. They're just so wonderful. They really are good. But they provide a lot of inspiration for my writing as well. I have another book of essays just about teaching and everything that goes on in the classroom that both bamboozles and inspires the teaching experience. Okay, so that's my background. And back to these books. Soviet Union fell in 1991. I was still single, and I said to myself, I'd like to have a family. And I said, if I'm not in a relationship by the time I'm in my 30s, I'm just going to try to do it anyway. And so my 30s dawned, inevitably. And the hardest part was picking up the phone, calling the adoption agency and in Lewiston, and saying I'm interested in adopting as a single. And I was welcomed, but they warned me. They said, we're happy to work with you, but the countries that we look for children in tend to be very conservative and traditional. So they understand mother and child. They don't really understand father and child. I mean, you think of it, of the art scene. You have Madonna and Child. You don't have many paintings of Joseph with Jesus throwing the ball or something like that. So what my caseworker said was very prescient, because it became kind of nightmarish. For 2 years, I struggled country by country. I speak Spanish, and so we covered South America. We covered Central America. One by one, the countries said no, absolutely impossible. And so I'm of Polish ancestry, and so my caseworker suggested Poland might be an opportunity. So we approached Poland, and Poland said absolutely not, no singles, period. And so after 2 years, I had already spent a lot of money, because adoption is expensive. And I didn't know what to do. And my caseworker said, do you want to quit? And I said, no, I don't want to quit. I'm too deep into it. And so I persisted, and I discovered an organization called the Committee for Single Adoptive Parents. And yada, 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 they dealt with Russia, and Russia would allow singles to adopt. And I called my caseworker. She knew a caseworker at another adoption agency in New Mexico who worked specifically with Russia. Put me in touch with them, and they said, we have a boy. We have a 7-year-old boy. He's ready to go. And I said, I have a picture. They FedExed me a video of him. And in this video, he was 6. He stands up and he recites Russian poetry from heart. And I just fell to my knees. I said, this is the boy. This is the boy for me. His name was Alosha. And this picture is Alosha. That's the day I met him. That's in the orphanage. He was 7 years old there. And so I made arrangements to fly to Russia. And I had spent so much money already. I had so little money left. I begged a travel agency to find me the cheapest possible ticket to Moscow. And they found one, but they said, but you must fly Soviet Airlines. So it doesn't bother me, but maybe it should have, because when I got on this jet, this immense jet, it was pandemonium. Everyone's running around. I sat down, and a man accused me of taking his seat. I had to get out of that seat into another one. The seatbelt didn't work. It just kept unraveling like a noodle. When mealtime came, everyone got something different. It was a grab bag. They just kept... I got fish. The man next to me got a hard-boiled egg. And another woman got a piece of half-cooked chicken. It was just whatever they had around. And they said, welcome to the nonstop flight, New York to Moscow. And when we get into the air, 2 hours later, they said, our first stop will be Newfoundland. So we had to stop and get off the plane for refueling. To get on, they said, welcome to the resumption of our nonstop flight to Moscow. 2 hours later, we had to stop in Ireland. Eventually, we got to Moscow. The day I landed in Moscow, all hell broke loose, because someone had written a letter to a Russian newspaper condemning the idea of foreigners adopting Russian children. The man said something to the effect, they're bleeding our culture off. And so the Russian government shut down adoptions. I had a liaison there in Russia. At this point, I spoke very, very basic, simple, present tense Russian, but my liaison spoke perfect English, so that was no problem. I said, what do we do? I said, in the United States, temporary means an eternity of bureaucracy. What does it mean here, where they use an abacus to count in government offices? She says, just don't panic. And after 4 days, I was able to go to see Alosha. And so we got a driver and we drove 2 hours through incredible poverty. And I grew up in an era where Russia, or the Soviet Union, was presented as the great evil, incredibly powerful, a match, and but what I saw in Russia was poverty. And I said to myself, my gosh, this is a country with a first-class military and a third-class society. And I mean, children just wan, dirty children playing in the mud and among animals, among farm animals. It was quite striking. But when I got to his orphanage, I was very struck by how clean and bright and well-attended it was. The women who took care of these children were very caring, very, very loving. But of course, if you have 100 children and you have 4 women, there's not a lot of time to cuddle every child. So they put me in the middle of this room, and I'm standing there, and the director of child welfare for that province went into this other room, and she brings out this little boy in blue shorts, a white shirt, and socks. And it was Alosha. And he had no idea I was coming. No idea. She brought him up to me, and I said to him in my very primitive Russian, I said, do you know who I am? And he looked at me and squinted, and he said, Papa? Just like that. Yeah, it was quite moving. And so I spent the day with him, and after I did, my liaison said, what do you think? I said, somebody loved this child. somebody loved this child because his ability to give affection was quite pronounced. And so I said, I really want to go for this kid. But over the next several days, tremendous bureaucratic hurdles, a lot of resistance, a lot of doubts, a lot of second guessing, and I had to fight my way. I shouldn't say it was the Russians who helped me, were the heroes. They were mostly very assertive older Russian women. And for instance, one office was the office that had to sign the approval for the adoption. And when we got there, the young man said, oh no, the official he's off to his vacation home, so you have to come back tomorrow. And we had driven 2 hours. So I realized something about Russian society. If you have power, you don't delegate it. You take it wherever you go. And so, but the woman who was helping me, her name was Ada. She was about 74 or so, and she said to me, sit down and wait out here. And she went into the room with this man. It sounded like she was murdering him. And after she came out, I said, what happened? She said, nothing. Your paper is signed. And so that's the way it went, step by step. Eventually, I went to the orphanage after a few days, and Alosha looked at me, and he said in Russian, home. And so he jumped into my arms, and I had brought clothing for him, but I didn't bring shoes. I figured he'd have his own shoes, so the women berated me. They said, where are his shoes? I said, hey, I thought you'd have shoes. And so they went off, and they came back with a pair of kind of ratty shoes, and I put them on him. And as I was carrying him out the door, there was a boy crying, and I looked back, and he was barefoot. So they took another child's shoes. So when we got to Moscow, I took the shoes back, and I filled them with candy and sent them back to the orphanage, and I bought Alosha a new pair of shoes. And we stayed with a Russian family, 3 generations in one apartment, wonderful Russian people. And I got Alosha home, and because he spoke only Russian. And as the plane is landing in Kennedy, it was a sweltering July day. As it's landing, Alosha turns to me. Now, we've been in the air for 15 hours. He turns to me, and he vomits in my lap. And I said, Alosha, you finally had something you could give me. And so I got him back to Maine, and he was quite a wonderful child to raise, very impish, very active, very athletic, very loving. And a lot of interesting little things happen as the child is bridging 2 languages and slowly acquiring English. For instance, one day, he started in 2nd grade, I took his backpack at the end of the day, and he was already in bed, and I pulled out one of his little essays he had written in English, and it read, I love my papa, even though he beats me all the time. Of course, I couldn't believe this, so the next morning I said, Alosha, I don't beat you. He says, yeah, every time we play checkers, you beat me. I said, Alosha, I said, that's a different kind of beat. I said, did you tell the teacher? Did you show this to the teacher? She says, no. I said, don't show it to the teacher. You know, another day we were horsing around in the backyard, and I was lying on my back in the grass, and he was straddling my belly, and out of the blue, he said, Papa, where Mama? I said, how am I going to explain this in words he'll understand? And as I tried to explain, he put his hand against my mouth. He said, that okay, Papa, Mama. Just like that. So he had a real intuition. So Alosha grows and grows, and when he's about 13, I said to him, I said, Alosha, how would you feel about having a little brother? Because I felt at that point I still had the energy and the emotional space for another child. So Alosha put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, Dad, don't you think it works just fine with the 2 of us? And in truth, he was the perfect only child. He was the perfect only child. But a year later, he's 14 now, and he said, I've been thinking, maybe it would be good to have another kid. I said, why the change of heart? He says, because so that when I'm gone, when I leave, you won't be lonely. I said, Alosha, it's not like that. It's not like if you take a can of peas off the shelf, you got to get another can to keep the shelf full. I said, you have to have a better reason than that for having another person in the house. And he thought about it, and we talked about it, and we finally got on the same page. And so I went back to the adoption agency, and I said, look, I don't want to go through the nightmare I went through with adopting Alosha in Russia. All I want to know is where will I have the best chance of success now? Because in the adoption world, countries are opening and closing all the time. There's political upheaval, there are military coups, there are changes of outlook on the part of their leaders. Some of them are pro-adoption, some of them are anti. Like Vietnam is a very pro-adoption culture. Russia now is very anti-adoption culture, so I was lucky. But my adoption agency said, Ukraine is right now a great place to adopt. This is pre-war, of course. And so I said, let's go for it. The difference between Russian and Ukrainian adoption is with Russia, I was matched to Alosha before I went, so I knew the child I was moving towards. With Ukraine, you don't know anything till you get to Ukraine. All your paperwork is done, they put you in this room, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of profiles. And then you start to search for a child. So this, to say the least, is anxiety-provoking. But I was sitting with my translator going through all these profiles, and she slips one to me. She says, look at this one. And I looked, and it was a boy. His hair looked like Edward Scissorhands, if you remember the movie. His hair was out, his face was red and bloated, and he was crying. He looked hysterical. I said, this kid doesn't speak to me. But I kept glancing at him. And they said, and I said, okay, listen, I'll take a look at him. Where is he? They said, he is in a village on the Black Sea. You have to take a long train ride down there. And in the book, one of the books is Adopting Anton, I talked about the train ride. And it says something about, I'll just read a little bit. First of all, I should back up a little. I started in Poland. I flew to Warsaw because it was cheaper. And then I took a long 20-hour ride to Kyiv. And very interesting ride. So I write in the book, this is the so-called fast train to Kyiv. It says, I quickly learned that fast was entirely relative. The total travel time to Kyiv was about 18 hours to go 400 miles, an average speed of 22 miles per hour. The train would make many stops in places I had never heard of: Chelm, Yagodin, Kovel, Zdolbanov, Shepetovka, Kazatin. They sounded like place names en route to Castle Dracula. And I go, yeah. And then there were the villages, scattered across the landscape, and so impoverished it was as if they had been worn down to their bare bones. The train stopped at one of these sad outposts where a kerchiefed woman with a drawn, worried expression approached my window and lifted her baby in a begging gesture. I tried to open the window, hoping to give her a few Ukrainian grivnas, which is currency, but it, like the country itself, was broken. Our eyes met, and I threw her a gesture of helplessness. The train cars clanked in tandem as the locomotive began to groan forward, and I watched as the woman, face resigned, lowered the baby to her breast, turned, and slowly moved off. So, just like Russia, it seemed to be incredibly poor. I get to Ukraine. I identify Anton as a child I will look at, but no commitment. And I get to the orphanage with my translator way down on the Black Sea. And I'm sitting at this table with the director of the orphanage, the pediatrician, Anton's caretaker, my translator, and the director of child welfare. And we're talking about the child, and the director says, you need to understand something. 3 other families have come to look at Anton, and in each case, he became hysterical. She says he was so hysterical, I had to step in. I could not let him go if he was like that. I said, well, I don't know this child. I don't love this child. Let's just see what happens. So his caretaker went to get him. And as she's bringing him down the hall, he was so tiny, so knock-kneed. He was in like this leotard. His hair was shorn really short. And I said, oh, when he sees me, 6'3", so I said, I know what I'm going to do. So I got on the floor lower than him. And so when he came to me, he was looking down at me. And I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a plastic car, and he beamed. And he sat on the floor with me, and we pushed the car back and forth, back and forth. And the director said, I've never seen this before with him. And so we went to her desk. He's sitting in my lap. I was stroking his hair, and the women are talking. And the director finally said, well, you've gotten off to a good start, but if you'd like to take a few days to think about this, since you're in Ukraine for a couple of weeks. I'm looking at Anton. I said, you know, I don't see any reason not to adopt this child. And so I said, oh, I want to go for it. That's when it hit the fan. There was a judge who had to sign off on it. She was waiting to see what the decision would be. And she put out the word, I will not allow this American to adopt one of our children. I said, what do we do now? So I called Kyiv, and I was working with a group of lawyers who facilitate adoptions of Ukrainian children. I said, what do I do? They said, well, 2 choices. One is you can come back to Kyiv and we start over, or 2, we can fight. I said, fight? I said, if we fight, what are my chances? They said, we think your chances are good. And so what happened was the women who were advocating for me started to visit the judge with flowers, with chocolate, with vodka, with pleading, day after day after day. Finally, the judge's secretary told us, she said, the judge cried out, I can't take the pressure. I will talk to the American. And so on a beautiful sunny day in November, sunny but cool, my entourage and I, we marched to the courthouse. And we're sitting, all the women are on one side, and I'm sitting with my translator on the other, and there's just a wall with the crest of Ukraine on it. And the judge comes in, but she won't look at me. And so she sits at the bench, and she says, Mr. Klose, stand. And I stand. And she says, identify yourself. And so in my primitive Russian, I did. And she says, well, since you speak such good Russian, why don't you just dispense with your translator? I said, it's not that good. So she said, okay, the first question. Who's going to cook for this child? And I said, in the back of my head, I'm saying, I don't believe this. But I said, Your Honor, I know what you're saying. In Ukraine, the woman cooks. But in the United States, it's not uncommon for a man to cook. I cook for Alosha, I will cook for Anton. She says, okay, so you'll cook for him. If he has a problem in school, who will go to school and talk to the teacher? I said, Your Honor, I'm a teacher, and I know how to talk to teachers. I will go. She says, okay. You already have a child. Why do you want another child? And I said, Your Honor, I said, there are only, you can have a child the natural way. I'm not in a position to do that. Or I can elect to adopt this child. Isn't that a wonderful thing that he will have a home? He doesn't have a home now. He will have a home. That's why I'm adopting him. She says, okay, who's going to speak for this man? And the women lined up. And they were crying and beating their breasts and pleading. And then I was looking at the judge, and a tear came out of her eye. I said, I got it. As she took her glasses off, she said, Mr. Klose, it's clear you've stolen every heart in this classroom today, including mine. You may not have come to Ukraine with a wife, but I think you're going to leave with one. I'll never forget that. So she gave us her blessing, but to save face, she imposed a 30-day waiting period, which means I had to fly back to the States and leave Anton in the orphanage for 30 days. It was hard to explain that to him because he thought I was simply leaving him. But I explained to him, and then I took all the women out to a restaurant, which was no more than the front room of a woman's home, and she cooked assiduously in the kitchen. So I took 6 women out with 3-course meals plus drinks. Now, adding it up in my head, I'm saying, my gosh, this cost a fortune. Can I afford it? Can I really take a card? 3-course meals, including desserts and drinks, for 7 people cost $9.82. I said, this must be what it's like to be rich. And at another table, there was a group of women, apparently on their lunch break, and one of the women came over, and I could understand what she was saying to the people at my table. She says, who is this man and why is he speaking English? And they explained to her, they said, he's in Ukraine to adopt a Ukrainian child. So the woman throws herself in my lap and puts her arms around me. She says, don't take the child, marry me. I said, maybe the judge was right. I don't know. So I said to her, I said, one thing at a time, one thing at a time. So I got Anton home. 22 hours it took us to get home. And he was great on the flight. But the moment we landed, he started to cry hysterically, and he cried for about a month. And Alosha, who was 15 at the time, Alosha said, can't we just put him under a tree? Put him under a tree and just walk away? I said, Alosha, it will pass. Because Alosha wasn't a crier. Anton was a crier. Alosha wasn't a whiner. Anton was a whiner. Alosha didn't cling. Anton clung. So it was different. So it just took a while, but it did. See, when I was growing up, we called these phases. We didn't ship the kids off to psychiatrists immediately. And the phase passed. And he just got with the program. And so to make the long, I'm just keeping track of my time so I can respect yours. Oh, perfect. I usually speak for 29 minutes, but 6:29. But we started 2 minutes late. So the boys, there's 10 years between them. And I'll just show you a few pictures. And I get to push the magic button.
Oh, yeah.
I always tell people I'm a biologist, not a technician, and I teach mostly engineers. I always tell the engineers, fix it, make it work. And the button I push is the forward button. Yeah. That's Alosha, I said, in the orphanage. His given name is actually Alexei, but Russian children, or children from Russian-speaking cultures, all have diminutives. So if your name is Alexei, you're Alosha. If you're a girl, your name is Maria, it's Masha. If your name is Alexander, it's Sasha. So Alyosha is actually Alexei. And if you've ever read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, Alosha was the peacemaker. He was the good child. The other 2 brothers were horrible. Okay. This is his passport photo, which is so Soviet. And this was the very first picture I have of him. And looking straight ahead into his future. And this is during the first couple of weeks at my house, and he decided to sit on a rock. So, and this is his first school photo, 2nd grade photo. And this is Alosha now. As a few years ago, as a young man, he joined the United States Coast Guard. And in his early 20s, he was ebbing and flowing a lot. You know, he was working in a Thai restaurant, but not in Heartland. And he was doing all these little things here and there and not really getting any traction. And he tried college. He left college. So one day he came to my office. He said, Dad, can I ask you a question? I said, what? He said, would you mind if I joined the Coast Guard? I said, Alosha, I would raise the flag if you joined the Coast Guard. And so he got in. It's not an easy service to get into, but somehow he got in. And he had a good 6-year tour in the Coast Guard. So that's the day he graduated boot camp. So I'm very happy he did that. It taught him a lot. And this is the earliest picture I have of Anton, and this is Anton here. This is on the steps of the orphanage. This picture was sent to me by this woman, and the 2 little girls on either side of her she and her husband adopted them, and they live in New Hampshire now. So actually, Losha tells me that he begged them to adopt him as well, but that, of course they couldn't do it. But this is an early picture of Anton. And that's the first picture I have of Anton in my knowing him. I went to the orphanage there and snapped that. And this is an interesting picture. This is Anton a number of years ago. When Anton was 16, I was home. It was high summer, and he said he was going to go swimming. And I said, fine, there's a swimming hole in Orono, one of the rivers. I said, just be careful with the current. And he went up there, and a half hour later I get a call, and all that the voice said was, he's all right. I said, who is this? They said, this is the fire department. You need to come up here to the park. And so I raced up there. It was pandemonium. There was an ambulance, 2 cop cars, fire truck, and a crowd of people. And Anton is sitting on this platform of the truck. And I said, what happened? And one of the policemen said to me, your son jumped into the river and saved 2 drowning people. Well, he and his friend, both of them jumped in. And I looked at Anton, and he gave me this Cheshire Cat smile that said, to me, what the smile said was, you see, Dad, even though I'm 16, I can still be good. And I said, Alosha, you're going to get a lot of, Anton, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this. And I said, this means a lot. You know, you saved lives. So anyway, the Ukrainian consulate in New York got wind of this, and they invited us down. And so we went to the consulate, and that's the legate there, the liaison, and they treated us royally, just beautifully. And as we left the consulate, she said to Anton, come back anytime, this is your home. So really nice sentiment, because Alosha really feels nothing for Russia, doesn't want to go back. Out of sight, out of mind, he's happy to be here. Anton has deep feelings for Ukraine. His car is plastered with decals and flags, and quite striking. And Anton wants to go back to visit, and but of course it's not a good time. So, but he is quite something. I think those are the only few pictures I have.
Okay.
So I think that is my allotted time for speaking. I'd like to ask you, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them, please.
How old are they now?
Alosha is 38, Anton is 28. Yeah, hard to believe. Yeah. Anton just came back. Alosha lives in Florida. He has a girlfriend there on the West Coast. And Alosha went to a commercial diving school. And now he's working as a welder, but above the waterline right now. But Anton just came back visiting him, and so I was very happy because Anton really misses him. And because as Anton put it, he said, basically I had 3 years with Alosha before Alosha moved out. And so I really never had a brother for long. And so, they have a good relationship. Yeah, so I'm happy. I'm lucky because adoptions don't always go well. Sometimes they don't go well. And I have some friends, and they have a boy they adopted in Russia. It's been a living nightmare, an absolute nightmare. They adopted him as a baby. And of course, it wasn't until he matured a little that they could see what was going on. And when I was adopting the boys, especially Alosha, people said to me, oh, you're adopting a 7-year-old. You're going to have problems. I said, on the contrary, a 7-year-old, you can see what's in that personality. There's something, you can communicate with this person. So I said, if there's something which is not remediable, well, then maybe it isn't a good idea. But I'll be able to tell. And so, but when adopting a baby, you're adopting a closed package. And when this boy's package opened up, just unfathomable difficulties, violence, destruction, vandalism, multiple felonies. So parents have been very heroic. So, quite an experience. Yes?
I have a friend who adopted a little girl from Russia
Ah.
before they put the brakes on us
Oh,
and no
yeah.
more. And it's part of her story echoed yours. She said they were told before they went there, you're going to have to bribe a lot of people. And it was chocolate, it was money.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, but I think they'd seen her beforehand.
Mhm.
She was 10 months old, but they only realized in retrospect that they hid a lot about her background. And it turns out that both parents were alcoholics. And so
That's the major concern in the Slavic lands, is alcoholism. So, yeah, definitely it was on my mind. And but when I spent time with Alosha, I was in the Navy. I worked in medicine for 4 years, and my best take was this kid did not have fetal alcohol effect or anything. But certainly it's something that's on your mind, because in Russia, I remember in Moscow, children would set up card tables by the side of the road, and you could pull over, get a shot of vodka, and then keep driving. So you get vodka on the run. And there was a period when people were encouraged to drink more vodka, because it gave the government more control. And so it was promoted, the drinking of vodka in Russia. So once you establish a tradition, a governmentally ordained tradition, it's a hard one to change. But yeah, that is something.
And it's,
Yeah.
she's 22 now. And
How's she doing?
Well, she had a very difficult time in school.
Mm-hmm.
She graduated with like the ability to read 6th grade level, can't
Yeah.
really compose anything.
Yeah.
And so they sued the school district, which I think was sort of unethical, and got $50,000 from the school district to pay for her to go into this extended education, kind of like college prep,
Yeah.
but it offered very few career opportunities. It was like criminal justice, and so she's graduating from that this semester. I don't know. They kind of gave her good grades, but her mother isn't convinced that it really means something.
Yeah, well, my caseworker was very clear-eyed about these things, and while I was in the process, she said, she'd been at the job for 30 years or so, she said, maybe these kids are not going to be on the first mission to Mars, but maybe they'll be very, very happy Masons. Maybe they'll be very, very content electricians, which is perfectly honorable professions. I've sent some of my students from the university into the trades.
Well, and that's where I think part of the problem is, because the mother is very smart. The father, adopted father, is a plumber.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he'd have a problem with that, but they fought a lot, especially the father and the daughter, because they're a Catholic family, and she was like rejecting the church, and that turned into a big flashpoint. And at one point, he was like pulling her across the living room by her hair, real bad fights. And so everything calmed down when she went into this 2-year program, and I'm like, because I was thinking, yeah, just like you don't have to be a college graduate. You could even live with your parents and have a job and live with them until you get established. But that seems to be something.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned plumber. The joke or the story about a brain surgeon calls a plumber, and the plumber comes to the house, works for 5 minutes, gives the brain surgeon a bill for $1,500. The brain surgeon says, $1,500? I'm a brain surgeon. I don't get that much money for 5 minutes of work. And the plumber says, that's why I left brain surgery. So, yeah.
No, but yeah, it's mixed expectations too.
Any questions, sir?
Sorry. Thank you for your insight and for your experience. Geopolitical has changed a little bit. The war last 3 years now. I would imagine there's a dire need for adoption in Ukraine and around it.
Yes.
Are these not just adoption of children, but also of the parent that's left?
Yeah.
That's also been damaged in many ways. Or do we have a policy?
We do have
people coming in?
It's not up to us, it's up to those countries. Russia has
Closed.
under who was, it must have been under Obama, someone, we did something or said something that displeased Putin, so he closed down adoptions by Americans, which was tragic because a lot of the Americans had met the children already. They had set up their rooms, so that was very, very, and I said, oh my God, I'm so happy I got Alosha out. So we cannot adopt from Russia. I think the number I've heard is there are about 400,000 children in Russian orphanages. And so the question sometimes comes up, why don't the Russians adopt them? And the answer I understand to be true from talking to Russians is that Russians view orphaned children as damaged goods. And they're not inclined to adopt them. As far as Ukraine goes, I believe Ukraine is open to Americans, but no longer American singles. So when I was adopting, single women have a long, successful track record adopting. Single men adopting is much more unusual. You're getting more and more. And when I wrote Adopting Alosha, I got a lot of contacts from men interested in adopting. And I'd say it's a tough road. If you persist, you'll succeed, but it's going to take a while. So to answer your question more succinctly, Russia, no, Ukraine, yes, but not the singles. That's the policy right now. Yes?
Did you try to adopt in the U.S. and unsuccessfully?
That's a good question. When I talk about this with, sometimes I speak to parenting classes at the university, and that's one of the questions always comes up, why didn't you adopt domestically? And the answer is this: we really don't have orphans in this country, occasionally. What we have is children in foster care who are eligible for adoption, but the parents are still alive. They're around. Now, no parent wants to give up a kid, even if they know that they're responsible for the neglect or the abuse. So when you adopt an American child, you're also adopting the biological family. They want in. Now, could work, but as a single, I didn't want to have to deal with that. And I wanted a child who was free and clear, and no one's going to come up in the background and say, what are you doing? Or I'm the real parent, and I don't want to have to struggle with that. So I wanted a true orphan, and in order to find an orphan, you've got to go overseas, and traditionally singles have been sent overseas. Yeah, that's the long and the short of it. Yes, ma'am?
That would be such a hard situation for the kid, to have the real parents and then the adoptive parent or parents, and the dynamics, I can't even imagine.
I'm privy to some horror stories, but this little girl sitting there, so I'm not going to tell them. So yeah, there are some horrible things that happened. Yeah.
That was why my friend went to Russia too. She said she'd heard too many stories of parents wanting them back, and state laws are different. Some of them give a pretty extended take back.
Yeah,
and she said, I couldn't imagine bonding with a child and then them saying, no.
And that's happened. Children have been retrieved after living for years with a family. And it does vary state by state, and so that's heartbreaking. What are other questions that I can answer?
Did Anton speak just Ukrainian?
Anton was a Russian speaker, but he understood some Ukrainian because the situation was, before the war, there was so much Russian spoken in Ukraine. It was easier for Ukrainians to speak Russian than Ukrainian. And when I was there was a campaign to try to get them to start using Ukrainian. Ukrainian is closer to Polish than it is to Russian. And now, of course, they're speaking Ukrainian. But when I was at the orphanage, one of the women caretakers, when the children were eating in the refectory, she would speak to them in Ukrainian, and they could respond in Ukrainian. And even now, when I joke around with Anton, I know a few words of Ukrainian, and I'll say that he smiles sheepishly. But if I speak Russian with him in a very elementary fashion, he'll respond, but he's not highly motivated to learn it. Once you have lost a language to a great extent. For those of you who've studied language, it's a real slog. Language learning is because if you have English in your head, that's the filter through which everything else passes. So it's hard, to acquire languages and to acquire them back. People say things like, "Well, it's really still there." Well, it's not. It's not really there. If it were there, you could coax it out. It's not there anymore. He knows some basic words.
So Alosha didn't really talk with him in Russian.
He did.
At the beginning?
Because I sat Alosha down. I said, "Alosha, when I bring Anton home, you're going to have to speak Russian with him in the beginning." And Alosha said, "I'll do it until he learns some English." And I'm stopping. So when I brought Anton home, Alosha was staying with some friends. So I said to Anton in Russian, I said, "Anton, this is your brother Alosha." And Anton looked at him and he said, "Durak," which means jerk. And so that was the first word he said. So where'd you learn to say that? Is that the whole language thing is as a chapter in itself, watching one language ebb and the other language, flow, start to come up. And to hear Alosha when he was losing Russian and gaining English, I did everything possible to help him keep his Russian. I hired teachers, native speakers, to come to the house. I bought a Russian video library. I bought a Russian book library. I had one instructor for written Russian, another instructor for spoken Russian. But after a few years, Alosha said, "I just don't want to do it anymore." And it's very hard to do something like that in an English lake.
Yeah.
Because English is the language of the internet. English is when I was growing up, French was the international language. Not anymore. I travel widely, and every place I go. I mean, if I had a problem, I could walk to the middle of town and say, "Does someone speak English?" I'd be surrounded. You can't walk to the middle of a village in Nicaragua and say, "Does someone speak Ukrainian?" "Does someone speak Albanian?" You're alone. And which is why these people learn English, so they have something that it's transferable internationally. They can use it anywhere. And so the boys, their Russian certainly ebbed, and they retain a little bit. We would celebrate holidays, and I would bake Russian and Ukrainian things for them. And we had in our lives, we had Russian and Ukrainian people from the town that we were in touch with. And they were very good to the boys. And I just had the right people at the right time. One day, and because of my work, I was there when they got up out of bed, I was there when they got out of school, and I was there to put them to bed. Perfect. I had the same school vacations they had. One day, when Alosha was in second grade, I had to be late, and I called the teacher. I said, "I'll be there 10 minutes late." And when I got there, she was sitting in her comfortable chair in her teaching room, and she was rocking Alosha, and he was gently crying. And I said, "What happened?" She said, "Nothing happened." She said, "He said he misses Russia." But once again, that teacher, and she's still teaching, she was just the right teacher at the right time. And so the boys got a lot of nurturing from it, because especially if you're a single, to have that network of support, you really need it. Like one day, I just had Alosha still. Alosha was about 8. I got really sick. Apparently I had the flu and mono at the same time, so I was lying in bed. I could barely move. And Alosha came over to the bed, and he sat on the bed, and he put his hand on me, and he said, "I care about you." Just like that. I said, "I know." And he says, "Are you going to cook? You're going to cook something for supper?" And I crawled to the kitchen, and I put a hot dog in a pot of water, and I boiled the hot dog for them. But that was just those little things that go on, anything else I can? Yes, ma'am.
Do either of them ever wonder or try to find out about their biological parents, and how successful is a search like that?
Alosha, once again, out of sight, out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. Alosha was found apparently at the age of 4 or so wandering through his village, dirty and malnourished, and some caring neighbors called the authorities, and so he was taken from in these cases, there's never a known father. The fathers flee when they know that the mother's pregnant. And so he was taken from his mom, and he was put in a sanatorium. And he spoke so glowingly of the sanatorium. He said the food was so good. They were so kind to us. But he's not interested in learning anything. Anton is interested. He wants to go back to his birth village. Anton actually has sisters, 3. And the consulate offered to help identify them. And after they said that, I walked out with Anton in New York, and I said, well, Anton, there you have it. If it's something you want, you've got to initiate it. I said, I'm not going to do it for you. So I said, if you want it badly enough, you'll ask. And he's never asked. Never asked. So, but he certainly liked to see Ukraine again. Both boys have pretty solid memories, and since they repeat them over and over, it seems to be pretty accurate what they remember. Little snippets here and there, people and things they did.
You're really lucky you came along.
Well, there is an element of luck. There's no doubt about it. When I met Alosha, I said, I can't believe, because in Russia at the time, once a child reached 8 years of age in the orphanage, they were withdrawn from availability, so they could concentrate resources on the youngest children. So if I had waited 1 more year, months, Alosha would not have been available. So when I met him, I said to my translator, I can't believe no one wanted this beautiful child. So, but I guess his liability was that he was older, and there's a general aversion to older children. Plus, a lot of people want the child to have the sense of having been with them from the beginning. They want that baby, so they have as much as possible. That's the family endowed memory. So, but I tell people, I feel I've raised Alosha all his life. I've just misplaced the baby pictures. That's what I feel. He's always been there. He's always been there. Something else. We have a few more minutes before the sun sets.
I think I know the answer, but if you had it to do all over again, would you?
I was asked that question last year at the university by a student in the student group in this auditorium course, and the student said, "You're going to do it again?" And that's a similar question. Would I do it over? Yes. Would I do it again? No. There's just a tremendous amount of wear and tear. So much unpredictability, so many characters, so many people with the power to say this or this, and then the process stops and you lose everything. So much heartbreak. When I went to Anton's orphanage, I was surrounded. There were 8 children in his group. They all were climbing on me and talking to me. And there's a Russian word, dyadya, which means man. And so they're all saying dyadya, dyadya. And it sounds like they're saying daddy, which is really not what they're saying, but it sounds, that's the effect. And they're sitting on your lap, and the impulse is to take more. And in fact, Anton had a friend who was available, and I inquired. I said, I said to the director, I think there's a chance. And so we talked about it, but then her family came along and adopted him in Italy, so at least he's eating well. and that was good. That was good because, impulses can be misleading, because I would think to have 2 5-year-olds in the house. And being a single, when I think about it, that's a very slender thread. I was everything. And if something happened to me, it all goes. So your question's a good one. So would I do it again? If I knew it could turn out as well as it has, yes. If there was some kind of guarantee. It's a tricky question. It's a tricky question to answer as a single. Anything else? Yes.
It must have been like an empty nest thing when The second one left.
Actually, the second one's come back.
Okay.
Filled the nest. He was in a relationship, and it's one of the relationships where, father does know best, and I communicated to him when I thought about it, and then he learned the truth of the matter, and he, because I said, Anton, if what I see comes to pass, you can always come home. And so one day he came to the door, and at the moment he's home. He works, he's in school, making his way. He's delightful, he's sweet, caring, everything you could ask in a person, and he wants to get his own place, which is great. And so I had the empty nest for a little while. It wasn't so bad. I have a lot of interests. I'm always feeding my students, too. So, yeah. Well, listen, I have to say one more thing. This is always the most uncomfortable part of my talk. But if you're interested in reading in depth about the stories, I'll tell you this one last anecdote. I wrote a book about adopting Alosha. It was very well received. It was reviewed in the New York Times. And about 4 years ago, one of Alosha's, Anton's friends took me aside and said, I got to tell you something, Mr. Klose. Anton's been carrying something around in his heart for years. I said, what? He said, you wrote a book about Alosha. You never wrote a book about him. So I sat Anton down. I said, Anton, Alosha's story was so dramatic that it made for like a Cold War thriller. I said, your story wasn't quite like that. And I said, and besides, it's not easy to pull a book out of your hat. It's hard to get a book published. He says, I don't care. He says, I'd like to have it. And so I had a journal for the adoption, and I read through it, and I said, there is enough drama here for a book. So I wrote the book, and I went to several publishers, and finally a publisher in Connecticut said they wanted to fly with it. It was a publisher that they do mostly multicultural publishing. And they said they liked the story, and so they published it a couple of years back. Mm-hmm. And so one day, Anton was lying on the sofa in a funk. He was just having a bad day. And I didn't tell him the book had been published, and I had my advanced copy. And I walked over to him, and I said, I bet I can make you feel better. He says, no one can make me feel better. And I dropped it on his chest, and he saw the book. He went up, call your parents, tell them that. And he went up to his room, and he closed the door, and he read it from cover to cover. So now each boy has a book. If they are well written, I must say. And I tell people, I said, they're masterpieces. I wrote them, but they're still masterpieces. This is the Alosha book. This is the Anton book. The Alosha goes for 20. The Anton goes for 15. I did make change. So if you're interested, I sign them too for no charge, and I can even write something in them that will endear you to me and me to you. So I thank you for your attention. It's so nice to have an intimate group like this. What a wonderful reason to come to Dover Foxtrot. So, thank you.